So we didn't intend to have you sitting by yourself on a panel, but would like to welcome you, Mr. Emmet McGroarty from the American Principles Project. Please.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm here on behalf of American Principles Project, a think tank here in Washington, D.C. My testimony concerns student and family privacy. Therefore, I note also that I am a parent of school-age children. We urge the Commission in its report to the President and Congress to recognize that there's a qualitative difference between data from specific individuals versus data about things such as land, buildings, animals, and machines. CEP's authorizing statute implicitly recognizes that distinction in that it charges the Commission to study how the integration of data, quote, might lead to the intentional or unintentional access, breach, or release of personally identifiable information or records, close quote. When it comes to individuals, a breach of security with regard to their personal information is an important matter. We hear, it seems, on a weekly basis of corporations and government databases being hacked. Even the most secure repository of personal data will give little comfort to citizens. But the issue of data security is preceded by one even more important: whether government should have particular personal information in the first place. In that regard, today I speak about the collection and sharing of personal, student, and family information. Recent regulatory changes have significantly lowered the legal barriers to the collection and sharing of personal, student, and family data. The data itself can concern information way beyond simple academic performance and biographical information. It can include, for example, information about students' disciplinary history, assessments of their social and emotional development, and curricular and extracurricular activities. In certain instances, the law now allows the collection and sharing of such data without student or parental consent. Furthermore, since 2002, the federal government has undertaken multiple and successive efforts to incentivize states to build massive databases of such information. Such databases make free-born American citizens objects of research and study. It assumes that the goal of benefiting others in society justifies the powerful federal government collecting and disseminating millions of data points on individuals, often without their express knowing consent. Moreover, collecting and holding massive amounts of data about an individual has an intimidating effect on the individual, even if that data is never used. This is even more so the case when the collector has the force of law behind it. This fundamentally changes the relationship between the individual and government. Our republic rests on the idea that the citizen will direct government. That cannot truly happen where government sits in a position of intimidation over the individual. CEP's authorizing legislation calls on the Commission to study whether government should create a data clearinghouse. If the Commission recommends such a clearinghouse, we urge that personal rather than aggregate student and family data be excluded. In addition to the issue of whether government should have such records in the first place, parents and students should have a means to inspect their records, to correct their records, and should have notice as to whom the records might be redisclosed. Furthermore, with regard to the authorizing legislation's call to make a recommendation on how such a clearinghouse could be self-funded, we urge that any such receipts be paid into the general treasury. The creation of self-funded entities removes an important check that Congress provides, and checks and balances are ever more critical when dealing with such a sensitive issue as data collection. We also urge the Commission to resist calls to establish a federal unit record system. Section 134 of the Higher Education Act wisely prohibits the development, implementation, or maintenance of a federal student unit record system, one that would allow the government to collect personally identifiable information on individual higher education students and link education data to workforce data. Recently, though, an orchestrated demand for repeal of this prohibition has been swelling. I note the discussion in the previous panel in that regard, and I just want to observe that the call for more data collection, and the call to change this is backed by powerful interests and lots of money. There was discussion in the previous panel that there's been a softening of the playing field with regard to that issue. I work almost full-time with grassroots organizations across the country. These groups are not well-funded. They're funded mostly by passing the hat at meetings and things like that. However, they are highly skilled, highly organized, highly researched, and very effective. The lack of money, the way I think this plays out in the playing field, is that the resistance follows behind the actual organization, because the initial proponent of engaging in such an endeavor, that has money behind it, so it's easier for them to mount a campaign. The grassroots follow, but it follows with more vigor, and I don't think it will be defeated. These are essentially mostly parents, mostly moms, who are fighting to protect their children. We've seen this time and time again on related issues. For instance, the issue of whether or not we should have a common set of standards, education standards across the country. There's a privacy component of that. We've seen it in terms of opting out of federal tests. We've seen it in other related issues. So I am quite confident that the pushback from any such change is going to be vigorous and never-ending until it achieves victory. The purpose of such a system would be so open-ended that the repository is certain to be expanded over time to centralize data far beyond collegiate and employment data. In the creative, bureaucratic mind, literally everything can be linked to education. So why stop with employment data? Why not healthcare data and military and every other piece of information the government has access to? And I might further observe, why stop with just education? If government is going to enter this field of evaluation of a sector of the economy and collecting personal information to do that, why stop at education? Would such a dossier created on every citizen become permanent? Presumably so. If the goal of providing maximum consumer information is to be achieved, both historical and current data, constantly updated and expanded, must be compiled and preserved. The idea of the government's tracking individual citizens throughout their lives should be repudiated in our free republic. To summarize, we urge the Commission to resist efforts to collect and share personal, student, and family data, to recommend that any such information that is collected be excluded from any clearinghouse it does recommend, and to recommend that such a clearinghouse, if it is to be constituted, be subject to all the checks and balances provided by our constitutional structure. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present before you today.
Thank you. We appreciate your being here to talk about this obviously extremely important issue. Maybe I can start with some questions, and I suspect Ron and Allison will have questions as well. So just to start with this unit record system idea. I would be interested to know whether, from your perspective, there's a difference between potentially collecting unit record information about students enrolled in higher education versus students enrolled in K through 12.
No, I don't think the federal government should be collecting student level data at all. And that goes to my point about this is it really does flip the relationship between the citizen and government. It puts the citizen in a position of being intimidated by the government. And I think by analogy, if we think about it, if you thought of the most saintly person whom you know, and you thought, what would happen if they had a massive set of data about you? You could be confident, well, they'll never use that against you, somewhat confident, but it still puts you in a point of intimidation between you and that person. It changes the balance of power between you and that person. And that's going to be ever more so the case if government with a force of law behind it is put in that position. Not to mention, not just the force of law, but an ever-changing group of policymakers in charge of that data. So what's to prevent the government from changing the rules down the road? Really nothing.
So just to follow up on that, you mentioned early in your testimony the possibility of collecting data on students' social and emotional development and their extracurricular activities and disciplinary procedures against them and so on. But as I heard at least what the people on the previous panel were talking about, that wasn't the kind of information they were discussing. They were discussing information regarding enrollment at institutions of higher education and perhaps what program people were enrolled in and whether they graduated or not. Is that kind of information, do you feel any differently about that kind of information as opposed to the other sorts of things you were talking about?
No, I think it gets back to the central issue of whether or not government should have that data. And if you sit down and think about it, though, if we start with that unit record system, well, what's going to happen? Well, various institutions are going to start arguing, well, we're at sort of a disadvantage in the way this system is constructed. We go out and we reach out to, say, disadvantaged youth or recent immigrants, and there should be an accounting, or we have a special program to help individuals who have just gotten out of incarceration. So they'll say, well, we need some fine-tuning of this system to account for the special work we do and to give people a more accurate picture. Well, of course, that's going to require ever more data points being collected about ever more personal information.
Let me just ask a slightly different question. There are a set of agencies of the federal government that for a long time have been in the business of collecting information about people for statistical purposes. The U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, other statistical agencies. Do you feel differently about data that would be collected for purely statistical purposes as opposed to data that would be collected in a way that would let them, with all the protections and so on around them, as opposed to data that could be used in a way that would rebound back on the individual?
Yeah, I think the general rule here is the more information about an individual that government has, the more the balance of power is changed. And the more it has, the more it's claimed for ever more information. I think with the Census Bureau, there's well, first of all, having a census is in the Constitution, is required by the Constitution. And I'm not an expert on the census, but I do believe that there is a battle every 10 years as to what information is going to be asked. And then there's very strict rules as to how that information can be used and ultimately when it gets released to the public. So,
Right. I mean, there certainly are very strict rules about how the information can be used. I guess that raises a question that I might pose to you as well, and then I'll give Ron and Allison a chance to ask questions. But, is the concern that I'm hearing from you is that if you let government start collecting information, that there will be forces that will push for collection of more and more information, and it's perhaps not that you're so concerned about these first bits of information that might be collected, but you're worried about the slippery slope.
well, no, I'm worried about the first bits of information. We're talking about the federal government. I mean, the federal government is more removed from the people than state government, and that may sound abstract to some people and say, well, what relevance does that have in the modern age? But I think anyone who has worked in both state capitals and federal capitals and worked with state legislatures and Congress and federal bureaucracies versus state bureaucracies, really anyone who has gone through those range of experiences understands that state government really is closer to the people. And it's easier to get things done in state government. It's easier for constituents to be heard, and it really that further begs the questions. Well, why would the federal government have a role in this anyway? And it really doesn't. And then if we give the federal government a role in this, like I said in my testimony, where does it stop?
Okay, I have two questions. We have like 3 minutes left with your panel. Seems funny to call you a panel, but so one of them, at least, maybe you could send us a letter. You've used the word intimidation several times. If there are examples of the federal government intimidating people based on data that they have collected, it would be great to get those examples because I think they would be more persuasive than a abstract argument. And I'd like to know something about the magnitude of this problem. If this is a serious problem and there are examples of where it's happened, then the argument has legs, so to speak. Okay.
Sure, I'll endeavor to do that, but I would note though too that my point is it's the very fact of
Right.
government having that information
I get
that
that,
is
yeah.
intimidating. And I would, if you go across America and you go in the cities and out in the country, then wherever you go, there are people who are nervous or intimidated just to go into government buildings.
Right.
And the idea, I think that's understandable.
But my point is, the government has been collecting, you couldn't even describe the mountains of data that the federal government has collected since the very beginning of the country, not only in the census, but in any other surveys. So if there are examples of where the federal government has used this to intimidate people, we should know about that. That should be part of our consideration. Second thing is, I'm interested in formulate this. Do you believe that there's a reasonable benefit, that benefit cost is a reasonable case? Because previous witnesses have cited several things that they think are advantageous for communities, for the country, for individuals. My favorite, and one that I've been concerned about a long time, is that kids go to the wrong schools. It happens all the time, and they wind up with debt and so forth. It would be very good if we could give them better information about the track record of those programs and how people like them perform in these and what advantages they have and what jobs they go on to get and so forth. I'm not asking you to accept that argument as convincing, do you accept the logic of approaching the problem that way? We have to decide how to approach the problem, and a benefit cost framework is typical, so would you think that's a reasonable thing for us to do?
No, I think that would be very awkward, if not impossible, for the federal government to issue any sort of, come up with any sort of paradigm that evaluates schools. What do we have, 3,000 institutions of higher learning across the country that evaluates these in any meaningful way. I don't think that would be, and I think too it would be bothersome to students once they realize that once you enter this system of higher education, you're going to be tracked for the rest of your life.
Do you recognize the difference between description and evaluation? What is being proposed here and what the previous witness said they wanted was a way to describe what happens to students, like students that we're all concerned about, minorities, kids from low-income families, immigrants that you mentioned yourself, and how they do if they go to various schools. So the information is more about the schools than the individuals, and it's purely descriptive.
But to fully describe it, one would need a lot of data points about every student and would need to follow those data points throughout the student's academic career and into the workforce. And I think that's a massive undertaking. I don't think the federal government is situated to do it. I think it would be inaccurate. I think it would cause tremendous outcry among institutions of higher education that they're being unfairly evaluated, and justly so, which would create a cycle of calls for even more data collection. And I think that there would also be consequences among students. Probably there'd be an undercurrent of not wanting to attend those institutions.
Allison, do you have a question?
I will cede my time as I'm looking at the clock, but just to add my thanks for your perspective, helpful to hear your side of this issue, because it is very complex.
Thank you all for having this discussion.
Thank you for coming. If the next panel could come up.